The courthouse in Baton Rouge always had a certain chill to it, even in the middle of a Louisiana summer. The air inside was dry and heavy with the smell of old wood polish and paper, the kind of smell that clung to you long after you left. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead made everything look too bright, too clean, as if the truth itself couldn't survive in that kind of light. Outside, the world carried on like nothing strange was about to happen. Cars moved through traffic, people ordered lunch from food trucks, and a slow breeze stirred the heat off the pavement. But inside courtroom 3B, something in the air felt off. A quiet tension clung to the space, like a storm waiting for permission to break. She sat there at the defense table, a black woman in her mid-30s, hands resting tightly in her lap, her wrists still faintly marked from handcuffs that had been removed just minutes before. Her name was Danielle Harris. To anyone looking at her from across the room, she looked calm, almost too calm, as if she'd trained herself not to react. The cops who had brought her in stood close by, their hands never far from their belts, their expressions blank but heavy with unspoken judgment. The judge hadn't entered yet, and the silence stretched thin across the room. Danielle's public defender leaned toward her, whispering something about how things might go today, about the chances of a lenient sentence, about staying quiet and respectful no matter what was said. Danielle nodded without looking at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the empty judge's chair, high above the courtroom like a throne. Something in her gaze made the bailiff shift uncomfortably, though he couldn't explain why. There was no rage in her eyes, just a kind of stillness that didn't fit the moment. For most of her life, Danielle had learned to survive by staying silent. She, grown up just a few blocks away from where she was now sitting, in a neighborhood where the sound of police sirens was as normal as crickets at night. Her mother had cleaned houses for people who never bothered to remember her name. Her father had disappeared when she was 6. Danielle had been the quiet one, the girl who did her homework by candlelight when the power went out, who watched people around her crumble under pressure and swore she'd never let that happen to herself. By the time she was 20, she was working 2 jobs, one at a grocery store and another cleaning offices at night. People said she had a good head on her shoulders, that she'd get out of that neighborhood one day. And she almost did, until she crossed paths with the kind of power that didn't care how hard you worked or how clean your record was. The courtroom filled slowly, reporters in the back, murmuring between themselves, the kind of low talk that made you feel like they already knew how the story would end. A few people in the gallery whispered her name, recognizing her from the headlines. They had seen the video, or at least part of it. The one that had been replayed again and again online. Danielle being dragged through a hallway, her arm twisted behind her back, shouting something no one could quite hear before the officer's hand came down across her face. That slap had echoed through the room and through the internet, sparking outrage for a week before the news cycle moved on. But for her, the echo had never stopped. The 2 officers who had brought her in, one older, heavyset, with a jaw that looked permanently locked in anger, the other younger, nervous and trying not to show it, whispered something between themselves. The younger one kept glancing toward the door, as if waiting for someone to appear and tell him what to do next. The older one didn't need instructions. He was the kind of man who believed that respect was earned through fear. When the judge finally entered, everyone stood. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a face that had seen too many lies to still believe in truth. His name was Judge Warren Blake. To most people in town, he was a symbol of law and order, a man who didn't flinch when things got ugly. But behind that calm authority was something else, a quiet pride that came from years of never being challenged. In his courtroom, his word was final. As he took his seat, his gaze fell on Danielle. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She met his stare without blinking. For a second, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of recognition, maybe even defiance. The prosecutor began to speak, his voice steady and rehearsed. He painted Danielle as someone ungrateful, disruptive, and violent. He said she had disrespected officers, resisted arrest, and endangered others in the courthouse that day. He said the video the world saw didn't tell the full story, that what she'd done before that slap justified the force used against her. Danielle listened in silence. Her lawyer objected once, twice, then gave up when the judge overruled him both times without hesitation. Every word spoken in that courtroom pressed against her like a weight. But she didn't speak. She just sat there, eyes lowered, waiting. Somewhere in the back of the room, a woman coughed. A pen dropped. The air conditioning clicked on. Small sounds, but they filled the silence that the truth should have filled. What no one in that courtroom knew, not the officers, not the judge, not even her own lawyer, was that Danielle had come there that day with something more than fear. Something had broken inside her long before she ever stepped into that courtroom. The slap wasn't the beginning of her story. It was the last spark in a fire that had been burning quietly for years. And though the judge didn't know it yet, before that day was over, the balance of power in his courtroom would shift in a way none of them could have imagined. The woman who sat silently at the defense table would not stay silent much longer. And by the time the sun set on Baton Rouge, she would be sitting somewhere no one ever thought she'd belong, in the very seat of judgment itself. The days leading up to that courtroom hearing were the kind that stretched forever, slow, heavy, and full of the kind of silence that hides anger underneath. Danielle hadn't been sleeping much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officer's face again, that flash of rage before his hand struck her. The video had shown her body twist with the slap, her head snapping to the side, her braids flying. The whole world had seen it, yet somehow she was the one sitting in handcuffs. The days after the incident were a blur. The internet raged for a while, hashtags, protests, news debates, angry posts from people she'd never met. But just as quickly as it rose, it faded. People moved on. The officers were under investigation, which meant nothing. She was left to face the charges alone. At first, she had tried to trust the system. She went to court appearances quietly, followed her lawyer's advice, nodded when told to, stayed calm when the prosecutors called her combative. But there was something hollow in the way people spoke to her. They didn't see her as a woman with a story. They saw her as a case file, a face in a viral clip, a symbol. That kind of invisibility can drive a person to madness. Her lawyer, Daniel Brooks, meant well. He was young, overworked, and already half defeated by the time he met her. "We'll get through this," he'd said in their first meeting, though he didn't sound like he believed it. "The video doesn't look good for them. It might help us." But then came the reports that the video didn't show the full context. They said Danielle had been disruptive. They said she refused to comply. Suddenly, she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a threat. The tension in her life began to eat at her. Every time she stepped outside, she could feel people looking. Some whispered support, "You didn't deserve that," but others gave her looks that said she should have known better than to talk back. She started avoiding the grocery store, staying home with the blinds closed, her phone always lighting up with messages from reporters she didn't want to talk to. Her mother told her to keep her head down. "You can't fight them all, baby," she said over the phone, her voice soft but shaking. "Just get through it. Let God handle the rest." But Danielle wasn't sure God was listening anymore. She'd done everything right her whole life, and still she'd ended up on her knees, handcuffed, with the sound of laughter echoing from the hallway where the officers had dragged her out. When she learned that Judge Warren Blake would be presiding over her hearing, she felt a wave of cold dread. Everyone in Baton Rouge knew his name. He was the kind of judge who talked about respect for authority like it was holy scripture. He didn't tolerate disorder, especially not from women like Danielle, the kind he believed needed to be put in their place. The night before the hearing, Danielle sat at her kitchen table, the dim light flickering. The legal papers lay scattered across the wood. She ran her fingers over them again and again, the words blurring together. Something inside her felt like it was cracking. She wasn't sure if it was anger or something worse. It was the feeling of knowing no one was coming to save her. Across town, Judge Blake was having dinner in his quiet suburban home. His wife Elaine spoke softly about their daughter's college plans, but he barely listened. He was thinking about the case, about the troublemaker woman whose name was already trending online. He'd seen the video, of course. He didn't like that it had gone viral. It made the department look bad. It made the court look weak. And that he could not allow. In his mind, people like Danielle were part of what was wrong with the world, loud, emotional, unwilling to accept authority. He told himself he was fair, that he ruled by law, not bias. But deep down, he carried a belief that order mattered more than justice. And when power goes unquestioned for too long, it starts to feel like the truth. The officer who slapped Danielle, Officer Ray Harlan, hadn't been suspended. Not really. They called it administrative leave, which meant he spent his days fishing, drinking, and complaining about how the media twisted everything. To his friends at the bar, he was the victim. "You can't do your job anymore," he'd grumble. "You try to keep order and suddenly you're the bad guy." But even he couldn't stop thinking about the look she'd given him after he hit her. Not fear, not shocked. Something else, something that made him uneasy. As the hearing day drew closer, the city seemed to hum with quiet tension. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that said "Justice for Danielle." Police cars lined the street, lights flashing in warning. Inside, the staff moved with careful precision, pretending not to notice the storm building outside. Danielle arrived in handcuffs that morning. The officers were rougher than they needed to be, one pushing her shoulder a little too hard as they led her down the hall. She didn't resist. She didn't even look at them. Her silence seemed to bother them more than shouting ever could. In the holding cell before the hearing, she sat on a metal bench, staring at the wall. A guard walked by and muttered something under his breath, something she couldn't make out but felt was meant to sting. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. The noise, the cold, the humiliation, it all faded for a second. She thought of her mother's voice again. Just get through it. But she wasn't sure she could. When the hearing began, it was supposed to be routine. Just another day in Judge Blake's courtroom. But there was something different in the way people moved, the way eyes darted toward her. Even her lawyer felt it, a strange electricity running under the surface. The prosecutor started listing her offenses. Words like aggressive, non-compliant, and disturbance echoed through the room. Danielle sat still, but her hands clenched under the table. Each word felt like another brick being laid over her voice. She could feel herself slipping not out of control, but out of patience. Then came the moment. Officer Harlan took the stand. His uniform was pressed, his tone calm, confident. He told his story as if rehearsed. She was hostile, he said. She refused to obey orders. I used necessary force. Necessary, the word echoed. Danielle's heart pounded in her chest. Her lawyer objected, was overruled. The prosecutor smiled slightly, sensing victory. The judge nodded along. The jury, or what few were there for observation, listened politely, detached. But when Harlan looked at her, that smug glance, as if daring her to react, something inside her snapped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet break, like a thread finally giving way after being pulled too tight for too long. She leaned forward, her voice low, calm. "You hit me," she said, "and you think you got away with it." The room froze, even the judge looked up. "Miss Harris," he warned, "you will not." But she kept speaking. Her voice didn't shake. "You hit me because you could, because you knew no one here would stop you, because you wear that badge like it makes you untouchable." "Order," the judge snapped, slamming his gavel. For a moment, everything blurred, the shouting, the movement, the sudden rush of officers stepping forward. Her lawyer tried to stop her, pleading, "Danielle, please." But she couldn't stop now. "You think I'm afraid?" she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "You think you can silence me again?" That was when the older officer, standing just a few feet away, reached for her arm, too fast, too rough. It wasn't even clear who started it. But in that single second, the courtroom turned from law to chaos. Later, people would argue about what happened next. Some would say she attacked him. Others would say he shoved her first. But what was clear was that the room exploded, the gavel slamming, shouts rising, chairs scraping across the floor. In that confusion, something changed. Danielle didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like someone taking back control, even if only for a moment. And for Judge Blake, watching it unfold, something dark flickered in his eyes, anger, maybe fear, but also something else. The realization that his control over the room was slipping. The hearing was cut short. She was restrained again, dragged away, her cries echoing down the hallway. The judge ordered her held in contempt. The prosecutor demanded maximum charges, and the officers, the same ones who started it, stood by, breathing hard, pretending to be the victims of her defiance. But as she was pulled from the room, Danielle's eyes found the judge again. And in that fleeting moment, her expression was calm. Not broken, not defeated, calm. Like someone who had already seen what was coming next. No one knew it then, but the events in that courtroom, the slap, the silence, the explosion of anger, had already set something in motion. Something that couldn't be undone. And soon, the woman who had been dragged from that courtroom in chains would return, not as the accused, but as the one who would make everyone in that room finally see the truth, even if it meant tearing the entire system apart to do it. The courthouse was quieter than usual that morning. The marble floors gleamed under the overhead lights, reflecting the pale morning sun that filtered through tall windows. Outside, protesters had gathered again, fewer than before, but louder. Their chants echoed faintly through the halls. "Justice for Danielle! Justice for Danielle!" The officers stationed at the door looked tired, bored, like they'd already decided nothing important would happen today. Inside courtroom 3B, the air felt heavy, the kind of thick silence that makes people whisper without knowing why. Danielle Harris was back, dressed in a simple gray jumpsuit, her wrists cuffed as she was led in by 2 deputies. Her face was calm, too calm, her expression unreadable. It had been a week since the last hearing, the one that had ended in chaos, the one that left everyone shaken. Today was supposed to be her final appearance before sentencing. The judge entered the room with his usual authority, robe flowing, chin lifted. Judge Warren Blake didn't look at Danielle right away. He adjusted his glasses, nodded to the prosecutor, and began reading from the case file. Everything felt mechanical, rehearsed, the slow grind of a system that didn't bend, only broke people who tried to stand against it. But something about Danielle was different. Her stillness wasn't the quiet of fear anymore. It was something sharper, the kind of silence that hums just before a storm breaks. Even her lawyer noticed. "Danielle," he whispered, leaning toward her, "please, just let me handle this." She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. The judge spoke in that flat, practiced tone of authority. "The court finds that the defendant's actions show a disregard for order and respect. Based on the evidence and behavior in prior proceedings, sentencing is set." He didn't get to finish. Danielle lifted her head slowly, her eyes locking on his. "You don't get to talk about respect," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a shot. The bailiff took a step forward, uncertain. The judge frowned. "Miss Harris, you will not." "You hit me with your system," she said, her voice steady. "He hit me with his hand. You call it justice. I call it what it is, punishment for breathing." "Remove her," the judge ordered, his voice rising. The deputies moved toward her, but something about the way she stood made them hesitate. There was no struggle, no shouting, just a calm defiance that froze everyone in place. Then in one sharp motion, Danielle turned toward the officer nearest her, the same one who had dragged her down the hall a week before. She swung the metal cuff still attached to one wrist, striking him across the face. The sound of metal hitting flesh cracked through the air. Blood sprayed against the wooden rail. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People screamed. The bailiff lunged forward. Papers flew across the room as the prosecutor stumbled back. Danielle didn't stop. She turned toward the bench, toward the man who had sat in judgment over her, and for the first time her face showed everything she'd kept buried, rage, sorrow, exhaustion, all bleeding together. "Enough," she shouted, the word tearing out of her throat. The deputies grabbed at her arms, but she twisted free, pushing one into the wall. Her movements weren't wild, they were controlled, deliberate. It wasn't madness, it was released. Judge Blake rose from his seat, slamming his gavel again and again, shouting for order that no longer existed. "Bailiff, restrain her!" But the bailiff hesitated, stunned by the sight before him. Danielle had stepped up onto the bench's steps, the same steps leading to the judge's elevated seat. Her eyes locked with his, her breathing steady, her hands trembling slightly but her voice clear. "You think you're God in here," she said, "but God doesn't hide behind wood and robes." "Get down," the judge yelled, backing away slightly. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. One of the officers rushed her. She turned sharply, the loose cuff swinging again, connecting with his arm. He shouted, stumbled. The other officers hesitated, afraid to move, afraid to shoot in a packed courtroom with cameras rolling. And then it happened, the moment that would replay on every screen in America for days. Danielle stepped forward, climbed fully onto the bench, and sat down in the judge's chair. The gavel, still in his hand moments ago, rolled across the desk and stopped at her fingers. She picked it up slowly, her breathing rough. The room froze. The officers stopped moving. Even the judge stood still, his face pale. For a brief, electric second, everything hung in silence, the kind that comes when the world forgets how to move. She looked around the room, the reporters, the officers, the lawyers, the judge. And then in a low, shaking voice, she said, "For once, you'll listen to me." The chaos returned at once. Officers surged forward, grabbing her arms, pulling her from the chair. The gavel fell from her hand, clattering against the floor. She didn't fight this time. She just kept speaking through the noise, her voice breaking but clear. "You can chain me, you can call me angry, but you can't stop the truth." The officers forced her down, pressing her face against the wood. Cameras flashed. Someone shouted for everyone to clear the room. Her lawyer tried to reach her, shouting her name. The judge, shaken and sweating, ordered the room emptied, but no one listened. For those few seconds, those impossible, chaotic seconds, Danielle Harris sat in the judge's seat. She didn't hit anyone else, didn't scream threats or demand anything. She just sat there, breathing heavily, her eyes glistening with something close to peace. To her, it wasn't about revenge. It was about being seen, about taking back even 1 ounce of power in a world that had taken everything from her. The officers finally dragged her out, her wrists bleeding where the cuffs dug in. The door slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed through the courtroom, leaving an uneasy silence. Judge Blake stood there, staring at his empty chair, his face drained of color. For the first time in his career, he had lost control not of a case, but of himself. Outside, chaos erupted. Reporters swarmed. Protesters screamed. Someone shouted that she'd snapped, that she'd attacked an officer, that she'd lost it completely. But others, those who had seen her face, heard her voice, said something different. They said she hadn't lost control at all. She'd simply stopped pretending. Inside the courthouse, the officers cleaned the blood off the rail. The gavel lying on the floor was left where it had fallen. A single smudge of red marked the handle. In the hours that followed, the courthouse buzzed with confusion and panic. Some called for more charges, some demanded investigations, and some silently just sat with the weight of what they had seen. Because no matter how they tried to spin it, they all knew what that moment meant. For one brief, haunting instant, the woman they had called defendant had become the judge, not by title, not by law, but by sheer truth. And everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, had felt it. As the sun set over Baton Rouge that evening, the courthouse stood silent again, its windows reflecting streaks of dying light. But inside, the air still carried the echo of that gavel, not from the judge's hand, but from hers, a sound that would never quite fade, no matter how hard they tried to erase it. The courthouse looked different the next morning. The sun came up the same way it always did, but the building no longer felt like a place of law, it felt like a wound. Reporters gathered outside in a swarm, cameras flashing as officers pushed through the crowd. Their questions blended into a storm of noise. Was it planned? Is the judge pressing charges? Was she armed? But no one had real answers. Everyone had seen what happened, but no one seemed to understand it. Inside, the courtroom was still. The gavel had been wiped clean, but those who had been there swore they could still see a faint mark of blood near the base. The walls still carried the echo of shouting, the quick shuffle of boots, the gasps when Danielle climbed into that chair. It was as if the air itself remembered her voice. Danielle was taken to a holding facility on the edge of town, a small, dim cell where time stood still. She didn't say much during intake. The officers avoided looking at her directly. Some of them had watched the footage already, others refused to. The video from the courtroom had gone viral overnight. People all over the country had watched it again and again, the moment she struck the officer, the moment she climbed the steps, the moment she sat in that chair like it was her right. To some, she was a symbol of defiance, a woman who dared to stand up against a broken system. To others, she was dangerous, a criminal who had lost control. The same split that had always defined her story widened into a national argument. Talk shows debated her sanity. Politicians used her name in speeches, but none of them really knew her. They only knew the few seconds the cameras had caught, not the months, the years that had led to that moment. Judge Warren Blake didn't come to court for the rest of the week. Officially, it was for security reasons, but everyone knew better. He stayed home behind closed curtains, packing his study in silence. His wife, Elaine, tried to reach him, but he barely spoke. The image of Danielle sitting in his chair wouldn't leave his mind. It wasn't just humiliation, it was something deeper. He'd spent his entire career believing in order, believing that control was the same as justice. But in that instant, when she looked at him from his own bench, he'd felt something he couldn't explain, fear, maybe even guilt. He'd watched the video too, over and over. He told himself she'd crossed a line, that she deserved whatever punishment came next. But late at night, when the house was quiet, he caught himself thinking about her words. "You think you're God in here?" They played on a loop in his head. The officers involved were placed on temporary leave, though they treated it like a minor inconvenience. Officer Ray Harlan, the man who had slapped Danielle in the first place, told reporters, "She attacked us. We did what we had to." But his voice trembled slightly when he said it. Behind closed doors, he wasn't so confident. He couldn't stop dreaming about her eyes when she swung that cuff, not wild, not desperate, just steady, like she knew something he didn't. For Danielle, the days in her cell blurred together. She didn't have a lawyer anymore. Brooks had withdrawn from the case after the hearing, saying he couldn't represent someone who refused to cooperate. But the truth was, he was scared. He'd received threats online and his office had been vandalized. People called him a cop hater, a traitor. Danielle spent most of her time staring at the ceiling. The guards watched her closely, expecting outbursts, but she stayed quiet. The only time she spoke was when the prison psychologist came to see her. He asked gentle questions about her anger, her childhood, her thoughts during the incident. She looked at him and said, "I didn't plan it." He nodded. "Then what happened?" "I just stopped pretending," she whispered. Outside, the protests grew larger. Some carried signs with her face, others with words like "system on trial and power does protect you." People who'd never met her cried her name. Mothers brought their children, saying she stood for everyone who'd been silenced. The courthouse steps became a battlefield of voices, some screaming for her freedom, others demanding law and order. Baton Rouge hadn't seen this kind of division in years. News anchors replayed her story every night. They compared her to other women who had faced injustice, who had snapped under the pressure of being ignored too long. They showed her mugshot, the calm, almost serene look on her face, and asked whether she was a martyr or a menace. Her mother refused to speak to reporters. She stayed in her small house, curtains drawn, clutching a framed picture of Danielle from years ago, smiling in her graduation gown. She hadn't visited her yet. She couldn't. The pain was too raw, the fear too deep. When a neighbor asked if she was angry at her daughter, she shook her head and said softly, "No, I'm angry at what they turned her into." Judge Blake eventually returned to work. The courtroom had been cleaned, repaired, and made to look normal again, but he couldn't shake the unease. Every time he sat in that chair, he felt the ghost of that moment, her hand on the gavel, her voice cutting through the air. The power that had once felt so certain now felt fragile. He began to question his rulings more, his tone softer, his gavel slower to fall. Some called it humility, others called it weakness. The trial against Danielle dragged on for months. The prosecution pushed for the harshest sentence possible, assaulting an officer, contempt of court, inciting violence. But something had shifted in public opinion. Too many people had seen the footage, had seen the slap that started it all. Questions began to rise about the department, about the system itself. Civil rights lawyers reached out, offering to take her case. Documentaries began filming. Her name became a symbol not just for her, but for everyone who felt crushed by the same system that had broken her. But Danielle didn't care about fame. She barely watched the news. All she wanted was quiet. One evening, sitting on the narrow cot in her cell, she whispered to herself, "I didn't want to hurt anyone." Her voice trembled, not with guilt, but with something closer to grief. She thought of her mother, of the girl she used to be, of the years she'd spent trying to do everything right, and how, in one heartbeat, the world had decided she was the problem. When the verdict came, the courtroom was packed again. Reporters, protesters, police, all waiting to see how far the system would go this time. Danielle stood, shackled, staring straight ahead as the judge, not Blake this time, he'd recused himself, read the sentence. 5 years in state prison, not the maximum, but still heavy. The judge said it was for the protection of the court, but everyone knew what it really was, a message. Outside, as they led her away, the crowd erupted. Some shouted her name in defiance, others screamed that she'd gotten off easy. The noise filled the air, spilling into every corner of the city. In the weeks that followed, life in Baton Rouge slowly returned to its uneasy normal. The courthouse reopened. The officers went back to work. The protests quieted down, but the silence wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. The kind of silence that comes when a wound stops bleeding but never really heals. Judge Blake kept to himself. Some nights he'd sit alone in his office, staring at the gavel on his desk. It looked the same as it always had, polished and proper. But when he picked it up, he couldn't help but feel the faintest tremor in his hand, a reminder that power, once shaken, never feels steady again. And somewhere in a gray prison cell, Danielle Harris closed her eyes and imagined that chair, not as a throne, not as a symbol, but as a moment of truth. For a few seconds, she had made them listen. For a few seconds, she had taken back her voice. That may be enough, or maybe it was only the beginning. By the time the court settled back into silence, the story that had started with a single slap had already transformed into something no one could have predicted. The woman who once stood humiliated in a courtroom now sat in the same chair that had judged her, not as a criminal, but as a judge. Her name echoed across headlines, debated in homes, classrooms, and offices. Some called it justice, others called it chaos. But everyone agreed. It changed something fundamental about how power was seen in that city. The officer who had struck her, once confident, untouchable, now sat behind bars. His trial was quick, but the damage had been done long before the verdict. He claimed it was instinct, that she had disrespected authority, but the footage told another story. It showed the heat in his eyes, the force of his hand, and the silence that followed as she fell to the floor. The slap became a symbol not just of him, but of everything that had gone wrong in a system that too often punished the powerless. When she took the stand again months later, the court was packed, not for his sentencing, but for her oath-taking ceremony. Cameras clicked, reporters whispered, and people watched with a mix of disbelief and pride. The same hands that once trembled in anger now rested firmly on the Bible as she swore to uphold the very justice that had failed her. There was no triumph in her eyes, no arrogance, just quiet strength, and maybe a little sadness. Because victory, when born from pain, never feels pure. The public's reaction was divided. Some celebrated her rise as poetic justice, the oppressed rising to power, the system finally correcting itself, but others saw it as dangerous. A judge born from vengeance, one newspaper headline read. Can justice exist where resentment lingers? The question hung in the air like smoke. Even she couldn't ignore it. Every time she walked into her courtroom, she could feel the weight of it pressing against her. She wasn't just delivering justice. She was being watched, measured, and doubted. But she didn't let it break her. If anything, it made her sharper, more aware. She knew what it felt like to be unseen, to be dismissed, to be punished for standing your ground. And she carried that with her quietly into every ruling she made. There were nights she couldn't sleep, nights when she still heard the echo of that slap, the whispers that followed, the chaos that came after. Yet she reminded herself the goal was never revenge. It was a change. The officer, meanwhile, faded from the public eye. His name became a footnote in legal textbooks, the case that redefined conduct in court. He spent his days replaying that single moment, wondering how his temper had cost him everything. In letters he sent to his attorney, he wrote about shame more than anger. He didn't ask for forgiveness, maybe because he knew he didn't deserve it. But he did write one thing that caught attention later. Sometimes, you don't realize who the powerful one is until you strike them. For the city, the case became a mirror. People began to question not just the actions of one officer, but the entire system that allowed something like that to happen in the first place. There were protests, reforms, and uncomfortable conversations. Judges were given training on bias and power dynamics. Officers were reminded that authority was not ownership. And across the nation, people debated what justice truly meant. Was it punishment, equality, or simply being heard? She rarely spoke about the incident publicly. When journalists asked how it felt to sit in the same chair where she was once humiliated, she simply said, "It feels heavier than it looks." That line spread everywhere, quoted, analyzed, turned into headlines and think pieces, but behind those words was something deeper. She had seen both sides of the courtroom, the powerless and the powerful, and neither felt safe. Justice, she learned, wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. It lived in the gray areas, between anger and forgiveness, between punishment and understanding. Years later, during a quiet interview, she admitted that the hardest part wasn't the slap or even the trial. It was learning how to exist in a world that expected her to hate. "They wanted me to be angry," she said. "They wanted me to destroy him, destroy everything. But that's not justice. That's just another kind of violence." Her voice was steady, but her eyes told a different story, of sleepless nights, unspoken trauma, and the strange emptiness that comes after surviving something life-changing. The courtroom where it all happened still bore the faint scratches from the chaos of that day. Tourists sometimes came to see it as if it were a piece of history, the place where the system cracked open for a moment. Some said it was a sign of progress. Others said it was a warning. But to her, it was simply a reminder that power is fragile and that respect, once lost, can destroy everything. When the final appeal in the officer's case was denied, she didn't celebrate. She simply signed the last piece of paperwork, placed it in a file, and closed it. The room went quiet. Outside, a storm was beginning to form, rain tapping gently against the courthouse windows. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at her reflection in the glass, the same woman, but no longer the same person. She had become the face of resilience, but it came at a cost. Her personal life was quiet, almost lonely. Friends drifted away, unsure of how to treat her now that she was more symbol than human. Some feared saying the wrong thing, others simply couldn't handle the gravity that followed her. Yet she didn't mind. Solitude had become her peace. In silence, she found clarity, the kind that comes after surviving humiliation, pain, and rebirth. Her story wasn't just about a slap or a courtroom. It was about the imbalance that runs deep in society, between power and dignity, authority and empathy. It made people see how quickly justice can twist into cruelty and how easily silence can become complicity. Her rise to the bench didn't fix everything, but it forced people to look. And sometimes, that's where change begins, in the act of looking, really looking at what we choose to ignore. In the end, she wasn't the same woman who had been struck that day. She was something more complicated, both scarred and stronger, both burdened and freed. The court had once been the place of her humiliation. Now it was her responsibility, her duty. And with every case she heard, every verdict she gave, she remembered one thing: justice isn't about power, it's about balance. When the lights in the courtroom dimmed that evening, she stood from the judge's chair, the air heavy and quiet. Her hand brushed across the wood of the desk, the same place where everything had begun. She took a deep breath, stepped down, and walked out into the rain. Behind her, the courtroom sat empty, silent again. The world outside still struggled with what her story meant. But for her, it was simple. It wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about proving that even in the darkest moments, dignity could survive and maybe, just maybe, heal what the law alone could not.